My name's Trula Remson, and I'm your moderator for this session. The session is called Suburban Slums, and in this session we're going to be discussing the fact that if you look at current economic conditions and their effect on the housing market, you'll see that the higher rates of foreclosure are happening in outlying suburban areas versus livable, walkable communities. In this session, we're going to hear why neighborhoods and towns that embody smart growth principles are not only more livable, but also are a better economic investment. Before we begin, I would like to thank the sponsor for this session, which is the Baton Rouge Growth Coalition. Our speaker for today is Mr. Chris Leinberger. Mr. Leinberger is a land use strategist. He's a teacher, a developer, a researcher, and an author. He balances business realities with social and environmental issues. Mr. Leinberger is a very busy man. He has 4 primary institutional connections, and those are: he is a professor and founding director of the Graduate Real Estate Development Program at the University of Michigan, the same as our very own Les Miles. And I commented on his tie. You'll see when he comes up, he's wearing the right colors to be here. He's also a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institute of Washington, D.C. He's a founding partner of Arcadia Land Company, a new urbanism, transit-oriented development and consulting firm. And he is the president of Locus, Responsible Real Estate Developers and Investors, which advocates for transportation, climate change, and energy bills before Congress. As I mentioned, Mr. Leinberger is also an author. His most recent book is The Option of Urbanism, Investing in a New American Dream, which was published in 2008. He is also the author of Strategic Planning for Real Estate Companies. He has written for numerous publications such as The Atlantic Monthly and Urban Land Magazine. Mr. Leinberger has been profiled by CNN, National Public Radio, Infrastructurist, and The Washington Post, among a host of other broadcast, web, and print media. Mr. Leinberger is a graduate of Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania and the Harvard Business School. In 2009, Mr. Leinberger was voted the top 100 urban thinkers of all time in a poll conducted by Planison, the International Urban Planning and Architecture website. And today we are thrilled to have him with us here in Baton Rouge, so please help me welcome Mr. Chris Leinberger.
So, how many of you were here this morning? Oh, good, because this is a continuation. And I've veered a bit away from just talking about the next slums. Talking about the next slums is kind of depressing, and I'd much rather talk about what do we do next? How do we take what we know so far about this structural shift that I talked about this morning and make it happen on the ground? So what I want to really focus on is how to finance and implement the 2 missing levels of governance that we have in this country: placemaking, on the ground, making a place, and metro governance, which you heard a little bit about if you were here in this room last time, with what John Fregonese is doing with the Baton Rouge Future Project, or Future Baton Rouge. So just to refresh your memory, if you don't remember this, that again, we're talking about a lot of our country's wealth. We're talking about 35% of the wealth of the country that you've basically decided that you care about enough to invest 2 days in this conference, and hopefully more. It's the largest asset class in the economy. And as is obvious to anybody who reads the business section of any newspaper in the country, that asset class is flat on its back. It's dead in the water. And we are never going to have a truly sustainable economic a recovery in this country until this asset class is moving again. But it's not going to be moving if we think it's just business as usual like the last 50 years, because the market has, as I mentioned this morning, structurally changed. And if we don't, as an industry and as folks who care about the built environment, fundamentally change how we build it, we're not going to get out of this mess. I also just want to remind those that weren't here this morning the importance of transportation. Again, I'm not paid by my Department of Transportation friends when I say this, but of the 15 infrastructure categories, transportation is the most important. It's the rudder of the ship. It drives where we're going. And by the way, I first learned this when I had breakfast a number of years ago with former Governor Brown in California, just the two of us. This is not Jerry Brown, it was his father, Pat Brown, a few years before he died. And Governor Brown is best remembered in California for putting in the freeways back in the 60s and 70s. And he was saying to me at breakfast that, he was getting all sorts of grief from all the politicians, from all the fiscal conservatives. Why are you putting 6 lanes of concrete out into the San Fernando Valley, out to the San Gabriel Valley? There's nothing but orange groves there. And he said, just wait. And you didn't have to wait very long, and all those orange groves went away. Those orange groves would not have gone away without the transportation system that he put in. Now, he put in one kind of transportation, and that was it. But that was then, this is now. That if you want this smart growth, walkable urban future that, as I said this morning, is what the market wants and what the economy is demanding, and quite honestly, what the fiscal conservatives are demanding, because it's so much more efficient, you have to put in multiple transportation options. But we'll come back to that. One of the key things about the transportation system is its impact on household budgets. And on the left is the average U.S. household spending on transportation. It's 19% of household budgets go towards transportation. The vast majority of that is to pay for your cars. It's the second highest household category as far as spending that there is, the first being housing itself. But now when you disaggregate the data, in the middle are the drivable suburban households. And they spend 24% of their household income on transportation. In fact, there are some census tracts, we now know, we didn't know this 10 years ago, but we now do it today, that are spending 30, 35, even 40% of their total household income on transportation. So these are households that, and if you heard Beth this morning, Beth Osborne, these are households that are driving to work so they can make a paycheck, so they can afford to pay their car payment, so they can drive to work. This is not a way to build household wealth. But many, many American households are in that position, and I'm sure you have kids or you are yourself in a position where you are finding yourself in this bind, where the cost of maintaining a fleet of cars because of how you have to live is really depleting your ability to build household wealth. Now take a look at the third diagram, and this third chart shows that I don't know how to use this program. I can't figure this out. I've tried. I can't tell you how many hours I've worked on this, and I can't make this work. But believe me when I say that for walkable urban households, the amount of their household income going to transportation is 12%. And I know for me, living up in Washington in a walkable urban place, it can't be more than 5%. We have my wife and I, walkable urban location, close to transit. We have a 3.5-year-old car, and we just pushed past a real milestone, 12,000 miles. And the bulk of the reason for the 12,000 miles is that my 93-year-old mother lives up in Pennsylvania, and the only way to get there is by car. So about half of that is driving up to Lancaster and back. So without my mother up there, it would have been about 6,000 miles over 3.5 years. You just don't need the car that much. And so this issue, the difference between drivable suburban and walkable urban households, that 12% delta, that difference between those two kinds of households, represents $700 billion per year. And to put that into perspective, that's half what the country spends on health care. Remember the health care debate? This is far more significant as far as how we spend our country's wealth. And this will be a significant thing that I'll be talking about in the future. And just to also bring this down to earth, the AAA tells you that in 2009, the average American spent $9,200 per year to own and maintain a car that they drove 15,000 miles per year. This is a Camry. This is a Buick. This is not a luxury car. $9,200 per year. If you converted that into increased mortgage capacity at even 6% interest, and now mortgage rates are under 5%, that converts to around $140,000 of increased mortgage capacity. So you drop one car out of your household and you can increase your mortgage capability by $140,000. Because the $9,200 is after-tax dollars. You get the tax break when you, with your mortgage, and you get to turn it into a capitalized value. It's a tremendous savings. And this is going to be a major economic factor in the future of our country. So I want to sort of lay out the good news and the bad news about where we are in building the built environment. The first thing is that we have structurally overbuilt the wrong product in the wrong location, which the market doesn't want. This is this fringe, drivable suburban product that is out there on the very fringe. It's part of the drive until you qualify affordable housing policy that we have in this country. And it is the reason that that the Great Recession happened. It's the ultimate catalyst of the Great Recession. You know, that the subprime mortgage crisis was really just the warm-up for the collapse of the drivable fringe suburban development. Out on the fringe in those markets that boomed, now Baton Rouge and New Orleans didn't boom and bust like, say, D.C. or Los Angeles or Phoenix or many other places, but in those places that did boom and bust, the fringe lost anywhere from 40 to 60% of their value off of the peak values in 2005, 2006, 2007. And the real issue here is that much of the fringe housing today is the market price is less than replacement value. Now that might sound just like an economics, kind of graduate lesson, but the fact of the matter is that when the market price is below replacement, there is no economic incentive for the owner to put the next dollar into that house. If the roof is shot and it really needs replacement, you just patch it, because that dollar you put into the roof, you'll never get back. If the kitchen is dated and really needs replacing, you won't do it because you won't get the money back. That's the definition of a next slum, when the market price is below replacement. And what we find on the drivable suburban fringe right now is that the land value is zero. Many times the improvement costs to that land, bringing the sewer lines, the water lines, the roads to that lot, that's worth zero. And in fact, the rest of the built structure, the so-called vertical construction, that's worth less than it cost to build it. That's the definition of a slum. So it's my observation that where we're going to see growing slums over the next 20, 30 years is in the drivable suburban fringe, where we built too much product. We've just overbuilt, and the market, therefore, is bidding down the price. And that this structural overbuilding of the fringe is the primary reason for this financial crisis. Not the only reason. We've got a lot of bozos up on Wall Street that we can blame as well. But it is the last gasp, and ultimately the bailout of our banking system is the bailout of sprawl. But what's the good news? Now that I've depressed you, the good news is that there's pent-up demand for for hundreds of regionally significant walkable urban places and probably thousands of local serving bedroom communities that are walkable. There's that much pent-up demand that it's going to be the driver of where we're going to spend that 35% of our wealth that is tied up in the built environment. And it's going to be the same sort of driver and foundation for the economy that the building of the suburbs were back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's that same kind of economic footing under the general economy. But it's important to note, though, this is not just about the redevelopment of our downtowns. Many times it starts there in our downtowns, in our downtown adjacent places. But what we're seeing is probably 70% of this demand is going to be satisfied in the suburbs. So it's not just the redevelopment of downtowns, it's the transformation of the suburbs. And as I mentioned this morning, it's going to go to suburban town centers that have a grid of streets and some historic buildings that you can begin to build around, like Bethesda, Maryland, and Stanford, Connecticut, and Pasadena, California. It's going to be, but it's also going to be the redevelopment of the 10,000 dead and dying regional malls and strip retail that's out there. That's well positioned, well located, huge expanses of land, 80% of it is under asphalt. But what it does take is a fundamental redirection of our federal and metropolitan transportation planning, because again, transportation drives development. So in essence, we have to maintain our existing transportation system, our roads, and that's a big job by itself. And we need to build the second half of our transportation system: rail transit, buses, bikes, walking. The implications for the economy, going back to that three pie chart slide, is that we're going to see a shift of spending in this economy from cars to other things in the household budget. We're going to, about 100 years ago in this country, the average American spent 5% of their household income on transportation. It's now ballooned up for drivable suburban households to 24%. It's my contention is that that's going to start coming back down as more and more people move to walkable urban places. It's not the end of the car industry. It's just that we're not going to be forced and dictated that every trip from home must be made by car. You're going to have options. You're going to have a choice. So we're going to start moving that money, that $700 billion, into other investments. It can go into housing. It could go into educating your kids. It could go into that most un-American of all activities, savings. It's going to take a good 30 years to catch up with the pent-up demand that I spoke of this morning. Here in the Baton Rouge area, say, if 40% of you want to live in walkable urban places, and you've got 3% of your existing housing stock in a walkable urban configuration, it's going to take at least a generation, 30 years, to catch up with that pent-up demand, because in good years, we only add 2% to the built environment. It's a very slow-moving sector of the economy. But it's going to be, as I mentioned earlier, the major driver of this economy. And until we get it back in gear, this economy is not going to be on sound footing. But it's going to take two things. Our founding fathers were brilliant, obviously, but they missed two things about how to govern this country 200 years later. There are two missing levels of governance. Now, note I didn't say government, but governance. The first is at the place level, on the ground. A place like a downtown, a suburban town center. These are 50 to 300, 400 acre places. These places need management, as I'm going to talk about. And the second is at the regional level, that our metropolitan areas are the fundamental building block of our economy. This is Jane Jacobs' 201. A couple of her books focused on this. And the Baton Rouge metropolitan area, the New Orleans metropolitan area, is competing against Houston, It's competing against Washington, D.C. It's competing against Munich and Tokyo. It's just that we don't realize it. But we're in competition, this region, on the global stage. We just aren't planning for it. Now, what you just saw on this stage last session talked about the Baton Rouge planning process. That's a critical first step to recognizing what ball game you're in. And I'll come back to that in just one second. Now, before I get to talking about those two levels of governance and what you can do to make a difference, I do have to talk about one thing that is critical for us going forward, and that's affordable housing. When you have these, when you heard me say this morning that there's this huge pent-up demand for walkable urban product and this tremendous price premium we're seeing, it means that we can't rely upon the existing affordable housing strategy that I just mentioned, which is drive until you qualify. That's the American affordable housing strategy. That if you can't afford a house here, well, just drive another 10 miles and you'll be able to find one. We need, in this walkable urban future, a conscious affordable housing strategy, both affordable and workforce housing. So there's a number of things that we need to look at in the short term. We obviously have to rely upon the existing tax credit and voucher programs we have in place at the federal level, where the federal level is moving forward with the next generation of Hope 6, which is a very successful program, and it's being updated in the current administration. But the other thing we need to look at is inclusionary zoning. It's one of the easiest things we can do, whereby a certain percentage of all new housing must be affordable. Very simple. And the beauty of it is that all it's going to do is lower land prices across the board. And it's going to lower land prices for everybody who's entering the marketplace, whether it's drivable suburban or walkable urban. It should be applied throughout the region if possible. The best example is Montgomery County, Maryland, north of the District of Columbia, which has had an inclusionary zoning program in place for 15 years. They've developed 25,000 affordable housing units, and it's cost virtually nothing to the county. Permanent affordable housing. Impact fees are very important as well. I mentioned earlier about the massive subsidy to drivable suburban. Anytime you do a study that looks at pricing, government services, and infrastructure, and actually charging the actual cost rather than massively subsidizing, you basically make up the difference by impact fees. And I was involved with a study in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when I used to live in Santa Fe, that looked at 4 of the 15 categories of infrastructure and found that to build the next housing unit downtown, you would need to contribute $1,000 to pay for those 4 infrastructure categories. They were roads, local roads, public safety, police and fire, parks and open space, and drainage. So they weren't some of the really expensive ones like schools and water and sewer. So $1,000 for a house or a condo downtown would basically cover the cost of extending service for those 4 infrastructure categories. Out on the fringe, $22,000. But everybody pays the same. Now, if you priced it out for all 15, I bet the downtown would cost maybe $5,000, out on the fringe, $80,000. Can you imagine if you priced that into the house on the fringe, that there would be a few different decisions being made by the market if they actually had to pay the cost? And this is also on the private side. I had dinner with the president of one of the major power companies in the Southwest a few years ago, and I asked him the question of, when you extend power to a high-density project near downtown, what's your cost in comparison to extending power to a low-density, 2 to the acre project out on the fringe? And he looked at me blankly and said, we've never looked at that. Well, I went to business school. Cost Accounting 101 says you should know your marginal cost of doing business, but this power company, which was a multi-billion-dollar power company, didn't have to do that because they just bundled all their costs up, went to the local, to the State Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, divided that cost by the number of units they served and charged everybody the same thing. They didn't care. massive subsidies for those fringe units, even in the private sector. We should make auxiliary units, so-called granny flats, legal. One of the easiest ways to bring workforce housing and help people that are trying to buy a house pay their mortgage, to be able to rent out an independent unit on the property. But it's generally illegal in most jurisdictions to rent something in a single-family neighborhood. This is discrimination of some of the worst order. Why shouldn't school teachers and policemen and carpenters be able to live in the communities that they serve? Location-efficient mortgages are being discussed, and at HUD, where you can increase your mortgage capacity if you're not having to pay all that money for transportation. But in the long term, the real way to deal with affordable housing is just to create more walkable urban stuff. Because if we provide more supply, it's basically a supply-side problem. We don't have enough supply. That'll drive down that price premium. But there's all sorts of other things. Focus those tax credits and vouchers at the federal level into walkable urban places. Build out the second half of the transportation system so people can shift their spending from cars to other things. That employers should be encouraged to move to transit-oriented development locations. They do that in many places throughout the country. So that's a program that we need to consciously do if we hope to bring this entire society along, not just the wealthy. One of the things that's important to also understand about the built environment is that you can take a look at your metropolitan area, whether it be a small metropolitan area or Baton Rouge or New Orleans or Atlanta, and they divide into 4 different categories. Down on the left side, you have that division I talked about this morning, walkable urban places and drivable suburban places. And then on the top, you can see that you either have regionally significant places. Regionally significant are places that are employment concentrations and civic concentrations, and a university is a regionally significant place, and the hospital complex is a regionally significant place. And you have local serving, basically bedroom communities. When you put that into a matrix, you end up with 4 different kinds of places. And what we're really talking about is building the walkable urban places that are either regionally significant, like downtown, or neighborhoods. But take a look at those percentages that I've guessed are taken up in this metropolitan region by the regionally significant places. We're only talking about 10% of the land mass. It's not that much of the land that needs to be densified. And one of the things we're seeing throughout the country is more and more of these, what have been called edge cities, these drivable suburban places that are regionally significant. These edge cities, these regional malls, they tend to be anchored by regional malls, they're becoming walkable urban. And we're also seeing more and more of the bedroom communities that are drivable suburban retrofitting to become walkable urban. So let's talk about how to do a walkable urban place. What's the process? This is for both regionally significant and local serving. The first thing is you got to figure out where they are. So here in Baton Rouge, as I mentioned earlier, you should have somewhere between 4 and 6 regionally significant walkable urban places if you're going to satisfy the market. Right now, it's hard to say how many you have, but maybe none that are working, certainly. Downtown is obviously not working yet, but again, if you heard the previous presentation here in this room, I think you call it Midtown. Is that correct? Center City? Mid-City, sorry. You can tell I'm not a local. That Mid-City could be another one of those places. But there should be undoubtedly something down by the university. Universities make great anchors for walkable urban places. In fact, universities now, more and more universities, taking the lead of the University of Pennsylvania. 15 years ago, Judy Roden was president, and she fundamentally showed everybody how a university can embrace its neighborhood and make it a really hip, safe place. And as a result, Penn has just skyrocketed through the rankings as a great American university, while 15 years ago you would have been afraid to send your 18-year-old daughter there. So you first have to figure out where they're going to be. I was just out in Los Angeles a couple weeks ago working for the mayor, trying to figure out where their new walkable urban places are going to be, because the city of Los Angeles, and actually the county of Los Angeles, has taxed themselves $40 billion to build out their rail transit system. They've probably already put in $30 billion into the ground already. You may not know it, but Los Angeles has a subway already, and they're going to build out the rest of the system. They've already taxed themselves to do it, and they want to know where their next 10 walkable urban places are going to be. You need to do the same thing, because most of those walkable urban places, by the way, will be around rail transit. Then you have to draw boundaries around those places. And I'm talking, truly drawing boundaries. And as I say, they're going to be 50 to 400 acres in size. You need to start figuring out, what are these places going to be? What's the vision for them? What's the strategy? And then you've got to put an overlay zoning in place to make it legal to build there in a walkable urban manner. And this is particularly important that people, and particularly the folks like the new urbanists and all the designers who think that the entire answer to everything is design. Well, I like design. I think it's important. But I think, since I went to business school, the answer is management. You got to manage these places. It's a 24/7 management that needs to be put in place. It could be a nonprofit management. It could be the city. We do tend to find that nonprofit management tends to work best. They tend to take the form of business improvement districts, where the public sector provides the service level they do, then the private sector comes in by taxing themselves voluntarily to increase the service level, to make it cleaner, to make it safer, to begin doing all sorts of things that I'm going to talk about in just one second. The other thing that you need to do is work with the neighbors around these walkable urban places, because you may have heard that some folks have a problem with growth. NIMBY opposition is endemic to this country. And by the way, the reason we have NIMBY opposition, I mentioned earlier this morning that drivable suburban places, more is less. As you build more, you get less quality of life. That's the reason NIMBYs exist. 30, 40 years ago, when I was growing up, when many of you were growing up, none of our neighborhoods were organized. We didn't have community organizations. They didn't exist. Today, virtually every neighborhood in this country is organized. They organized to stop real estate developers from building stuff that makes the quality of life lower. It's a rational response. But that same reaction takes place with walkable urban, when in fact walkable urban increases the quality of life. They just don't know that yet. But we're seeing in different places throughout the country that NIMBY opposition is being turned to what is being called YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard. And we're seeing strip retail places where the neighborhood groups around them are saying, convert that strip retail into walkable urban places so my kids can get across that 6-lane boulevard, because it's going to be traffic calmed, and they can go to an ice cream store, and I can walk to work, and it's a place that increases my quality of life. And oh, by the way, it's going to increase the value of my home. We have research that proves that single-family homes next to great walkable urbanism, the values of those homes go up between 40 and 100% on a price per square foot basis. The city needs to contribute land as best as they can, land that they own, or nonprofits can come in and start assembling land. And of course, the infrastructure has to be put in place, particularly the transportation, and particularly you got to be thinking rail transportation. And I know you all want to say, oh, we can't afford it. And as I think I mentioned this morning, that's garbage. That 100 years ago, all towns over 10,000 people had rail transit in this country and were 3 times wealthier on a per capita basis in real dollar terms than folks were in this country 100 years ago. But it's got to be a private-public initiative, and I intentionally switched that. I find it's best if it's led by the private sector. The public sector has to be at the table, but I believe in the golden rule. He with the gold rules. And in these downtown turnarounds and in these major walkable urban developments, for every $1 of public money, we're seeing $10 to $15 of private money. And if I'm putting in $10 to $15, I want to control it. But this management is key. It's a three-legged stool. The public sector has a role to play. Private developers, of course, have a role to play, private property owners. But place management is key. You got to plan this place, you got to strategize, and you got to manage it day in, day out. And in essence, we've now seen a management model evolve. If any of you went to business school, you remember that they talked about cost center management and profit center management, and the most intensive is investment center management. Well, on the left-hand side, we see that these places were initially managed just by the city, and the city would do what they do at a modest level. They can only do so much. Then the business improvement district comes in. They begin to improve the cleanliness, the safety. They may manage some festivals. But then you move into a profit center orientation, and all of a sudden, that nonprofit organization is making a buck managing the place. And then you move into the investment center orientation, and they're beginning to make major multi-million-dollar investments in these places, in the infrastructure, and getting a return on that money. It takes a shift in the mentality of what place management is all about. And let me just give you the best example of that in the country. This is Bryant Park at 42nd and Broadway in New York. 15 years ago, this was the nickname for this place was Needle Park, because this was the drug dealing center of Midtown Manhattan. And there was a movie made about 20 years ago called Panic at Needle Park, set here. The city managed that park at the time. It had a budget of roughly $250,000 to manage the best drug dealing center in Midtown Manhattan. They did a great job. They made it the best drug dealing center. Well, a fellow named Dan Biederman came along and talked to all the property owners around it, and they said, we want to take control of this park. They told the city, keep your stinking $250,000. We're going to rebuild this 7-acre park and manage it. Today, it's a $7 million budget per year, all privately raised. 85% of it is now raised on site. To the right, or where this shot is taken from, is a major restaurant, pays about 1/3 of that $7 million in rent. There's food carts, there's all sorts of sponsorship opportunities. And in fact, Dan tells me he could make a profit on that site. The 15% is raised by the voluntary property tax assessment on the property owners, but he wants to keep the property owners having skin in the game. So he took this from being a public liability to who couldn't make money with 7 acres at Broadway and 42nd. It takes an entirely different shift in mental thought process and management skills. And this is another one of the great place managers, Rich Bradley in downtown DC, who has taken Maslow's hierarchy of need, if you remember your college psychology, and where he talks about dealing with the basics first, clean and safe, welcoming public spaces, making it an attractive environment, get it programmed and promote it, build a sound economy in these places, get some great street life going, vibrant urban uses, get more uses in there, create a theme, create a brand. And ultimately, it's about a transformative experience that you have to come to downtown DC or Bryant Park or downtown Santa Fe to have. And if you have that, in business it's called a unique selling proposition, that you have a monopoly. If you want to experience downtown Santa Fe, you got to come to downtown Santa Fe and spend money to enjoy it, or move there and spend money to enjoy it full time. And that's what the experience economy is going to be about. And if you're not participating, and by the way, the knowledge economy wants to be here as well, if you don't offer this, the market and the economy is going to go someplace else that does offer it. Now, the big question is, how do you pay for all this good stuff? And particularly rail transit. Well, there's a lesson to be learned here, and it's from our forebears. How did they pay for it 100 years ago? 100 years ago, all those cities that built transit, 80% of them was built by the private sector, by developers. In the upper left-hand corner, that's the Pacific Electric in Los Angeles. That was built by Henry Huntington. He was not a choo-choo nut. He didn't do this to run trains and to make money off of those trains. He built it because he owned a lot of land, and he wanted to get his customers to the land. And he subsidized the rail out of the land profits. That's how rail transit has always been paid for. It must be subsidized. Just as roads have to be subsidized, rail has to be subsidized, and it's paid for best out of the increased land value that the rail creates. So it's my contention, and I lead a group of pretty progressive developers who all agree that they will come to the table. These are some of the largest developers, including Press Kabikoff out of New Orleans, by the way. He's on the board. That they've agreed that they will participate in paying for the rail transit out of the upside of the land value that comes from putting rail transit in. And it's a concept called value capture. And it's how, as I mentioned, rail transit was built 100 years ago. It's how rail transit is being built today. Grand Central Station in Manhattan was built out of the increased land value on Park Avenue. That's where the money came to build Grand Central Terminal and the rail that went up underground up Park Avenue. The New York Avenue Metro Station in Washington, D.C., the real estate developers around that paid for 1/3 of the construction of that new station. And I talked to one of the developers, a guy named Jim Curtis. He put in $5 million. He said it's the best investment he's ever made in his life. He feels he got back about $80 to $100 million return on that $5 million investment. And when you take a look, but obviously real estate developers aren't going to pay the entire freight. The rest of it's going to be paid primarily locally. And it's going to be going to your tax base, going to your taxpayers, and asking them to pay for it. 67% of all bond issues over the last 7 years at the local level have passed for rail transit. We're in this tremendously anti-tax time. 67% of bond issues to raise taxes in this country have passed in the last 7 years. There's a lot of examples. Metro Denver did it about 5-6 years ago. They raised $4 billion to expand their rail transit system. Metro Seattle did it 3 years ago. Metro Salt Lake City did it 2 years ago, and they had 2 months and it was led by the Chamber of Commerce, by the way. This is not some left-wing conspiracy. It was led by the Chamber of Commerce in a very conservative state. And they had 2 months to get the public support behind it. They got 63% passage. Los Angeles, 18 months ago, passed this $40 billion bond issue that I mentioned in the middle of the Great Recession, and obviously during the time that they continue to suffer great budget problems in the state of California. And the most recent one is St. Louis County in St. Louis, Missouri. 4 months ago, they passed a half-cent sales tax to build out their light rail system in the middle of the Great Recession, in the middle of this budget crunch. So if you tell me it can't be done, there's a lot of examples that will prove you wrong. But ultimately, value capture is just capturing the value that is created by the rail transit. It's taking that future cash flow stream and using it to amortize debt that you float up front to build the system. And how it works on the ground is illustrated by friends of mine in Kansas City. Done a lot of work there looking at how their rail transit system, when they build it, what it's going to do. And this is a view of Independence, Missouri, a town that right now is pretty much filled with surface parking lots. This is where Harry Truman grew up. It's a suburban town center outside of downtown Kansas City. So again, right now, a lot of surface parking lots, but it's got a grid You put in light rail, and you begin to grow these high-density, walkable urban places, mixed-use places. The vibrant day and night. And taking a look on the ground, you can see it. Young people just sprout up instantly. And very pretty young people. And one of the best views comes here at the end. As you can see, this small version of the Emerald City. And look in the distance, you see the real Emerald City, which is downtown Kansas City, which is also experiencing a great revitalization. So jumping now quickly to the metropolitan level, there's a need for this new governance at the metropolitan level, and you've started it here. As I mentioned earlier, you're competing with metro areas throughout the world and in the U.S. Envision Utah is probably the best model, and it comes from a very conservative Republican state that they've saved billions of dollars in new infrastructure and created a much more vital place that has choice in transportation and choice in how to live. But to me, it's ultimately thinking of a metropolitan area using the great American analogy, baseball. That a metropolitan area is a baseball team. And downtown is the pitcher. Suburban town and downtown adjacent places are first base. A suburban town center, second base. Lifestyle centers, these greenfield developments out on the fringe are third base. Out in the outfield are the drivable suburban places. And you need all of them to have a complete metropolitan economy. They all have a role, they all have different skill sets, they all go after different market segments. And yes, sometimes there are pop-ups that you have to call between the infielders and the outfielders. But the problem with most of our metropolitan areas is that the infield gets pissed off at the outfielders, and they say, we're going to go on strike. We don't want to play with those guys. Great way to win a baseball game, right? And we also need a general manager of the entire team. And we don't have it. We don't have it in this country, and we need, similar to the process that you're going through here in Baton Rouge, we need that sort of regional vision, regional governance to begin to create a winning team. What do we do right now, short term? I'm involved with Transportation for America, a major coalition of almost 500 organizations trying to fundamentally change transportation policy in this country because we need to build the second half of the transportation system. We have all sorts of organizations from AARP to all the environmental organizations, but the ones that are in blue up there are real estate organizations, such as the National Association of Realtors, who co-sponsored this conference, who understand that the market wants something different and we need a different transportation system to give it to them. So, in this recession, I urge you to plan for your walkable urban future. Economic growth will follow. Thank you very much.
Okay, he has about 10 minutes for questions. Do we have any? Come on, this was exciting stuff. How about over here first?
So the question was about, at the regional level, the state was a big mover in Oregon, which is undoubtedly the leader in this, and also in Minnesota. But you notice that I said governance. I don't think we are necessarily, I mean, we may some states may move in this direction to have a government like Metro in the Portland metropolitan region. But it's also, it could be a nonprofit governance. We have a lot of nonprofits already at the metropolitan level. We have metropolitan planning organizations that are supposed to be planning our transportation future. They tend to be pretty weak and dysfunctional, but we have it in place. We have Council of Governments that are all the governments in the region coming together to do long-range planning. Again, they tend to be pretty weak, but it is in place. We have economic development agencies that are either government or, in many cases, they're nonprofit, funded by the private sector. We have regional chambers of commerce. So we do have regional governance. It's just not organized, and it's just they haven't come together around a vision like, say, what Utah did. Because Envision Utah is really Envision Salt Lake City. And it is given a future growth path to drive their transportation investments, because transportation drives development, to drive zoning, to drive all sorts of regional decision making. And it's, Envision Utah is a nonprofit. It's not a government agency. So I don't think we know the answer to what form it's going to take. We have examples of government. We have examples of nonprofit. And I think you pick and choose what makes most sense for you. Yes, follow up. Absolutely. And that's what I was kind of suggesting, is that you've got some organizations, they need to be empowered. And obviously that's difficult, because we all know that everybody wants to control their little fiefdom, and giving power to a regional body is difficult to do. But if you followed what a lot of other places have done, say with a transportation bond issue, transportation's a regional thing. And so if you pass a bond issue to put in a starter rail system, that tends to be how it starts, that you do a one line. You just demonstrate the efficacy. Phoenix has just done this, by the way. And I mean, you take a place that is a car-dominated place, it's Phoenix. Phoenix just opened up its first line. Their second line's opening up next year. Their first line opens, and it goes from the northwest to the southeast. And it connects downtown Phoenix to Tempe, which is where ASU is. This could sound very familiar here. Tempe, right now, ASU is 45,000 students. It's going to 90,000 in 20 years. The president of ASU, a guy named Michael Crow, who's very powerful, and again, universities play a big role in this now. In fact, most university presidents have agreed with me when I've spoken to them to say that university presidents are really real estate developers today. And Michael Crow agrees with that completely. That he's putting the additional 45,000 students, all of them, downtown. And he's put the new medical school, it's built downtown just within the last 3 years. The nursing school, their biotech institute, the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism, and 5,000 beds built downtown. As a result, that light rail line has 3 times the forecasted ridership, because connecting ASU and downtown. So the starter line goes first. Everybody sees, wow, this is great. Then you come back for a second bond issue to build out the system. That's what Denver did. That's what Phoenix has done. That's what Dallas has done. And it can only be done regionally. And that's where you can begin to empower these regional organizations.
Got one right there.
Yes, in the back. I'm not certain you were here at the early part of the talk where I talked about affordable housing and workforce housing, that I spent a good chunk of time talking about the fact that we need a conscious, affordable, and workforce housing program in this country. The best model, by the way, I can point to is in Portland, where they put in a streetcar line, and it was paid for. The bulk of the funding, I think this is somewhat ironic, and it's a nice irony, out of the parking revenues from the downtown parking garages helped pay for this first phase $50 million streetcar line. The city said, let's go ahead and build this, but the one thing I want, the one thing we, the city, want, is that the Pearl District, where it ran through, should look like the rest of the city demographically. And that has resulted in that of the $3.2 billion of development over the last 8 years, $3.2 billion, a lot of money, because of a $50 million streetcar line, that 45% of the housing, all new housing, is workforce or affordable. I don't think there's another example in the country that's achieved that kind of level. I mean, we always talk about inclusionary zoning at 15, 20%, 45%. So it's got to be a conscious affordable housing strategy because we need a mixed income. We need working class and poor folk coming to wealthy neighborhoods, and we need wealthy folks coming to poor neighborhoods. We need the mix. So that's a foundation. It's a foundational thing to making this work, because if we only build Upper East Sides, we will have failed. And at Brookings right now, I'm putting together some performance metrics that are somewhat akin to, if you know what U.S. Green Building Council has done with their LEED ND, that's on the environmental side. We're putting together two sets of performance metrics for the economic performance of place and for the social equity of place, using a LEED-like ranking system. So the Upper East Side would be a platinum on the economics and a lead on social equity. The Pearl District will be a gold on economics and a gold on social equity. And so we got to measure this stuff, and we have to have public policy that's conscious. We can no longer have a social equity policy that is affordable housing is drive until you qualify. It's got to be a conscious affordable housing and workforce housing policy. One more question, then I'm going to have to go to the airport. Ah. Yes.
I had a question about, I guess, more the communication strategies that were used. You said that 67% of the bonds passed, and then you gave the examples. In those cities, was there a common thread that they all used to get buy-in from the public?
The thing about transit, it sort of benefits the same thing that linear parks do. Linear parks, and you may have seen the presentation about the Belt Line, which is one of the, up in Atlanta. It's the best. It's going to be an incredible model for this country in so many ways. But it links 50 neighborhoods. Talk about buy-in. The same thing occurs with rail transit. It links many neighborhoods, rich and poor, throughout the entire metropolitan region. So that's where the natural buy-in comes from. And the other reason that those bond issues pass is that, for some reason, voters don't trust money that goes to Washington. I don't know why. But they do trust money that's raised locally and spent locally, that they see it. And more, people are, when they hear that a rail line is going to happen, they begin to start improving the area even before the rail line shows up. Now, that, again, has challenges. There's no such thing as a free lunch. It goes back to the affordable housing and workforce housing question. But these things pass because it's local money going to local projects, and that it links neighborhoods and is much more inclusive than a lot of local spending. So with that, thank you so very much. And